I think the sounds of people entering the room have begun to slow. So I would like to say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to our diverse and global community. My name is Alicia Entham, and I am a PhD student in the Yale School of Environment, or YSE, an acronym that you will become familiar with over the course of the next few days. This year, I am conference co-chair alongside my fellow co-chair, Dewi Tan, who is a Master's of Environmental Science student at YSE. We're joined and supported by an incredible group of graduate students, staff, and faculty here at YSE, and you're going to see us both in front of and behind the camera over the next 3 days. So speaking of cameras, like I've said, internet reliability permitting, we would like to invite you to keep your videos on during this morning's opening remarks and keynote address. We hope this will foster a sense of community and motivate the same patience and graciousness for IT difficulties, for pauses, for those sorts of moments that during a live conference with ISTF, we've always witnessed the greatest of graciousness and patience. And while we're on the topic of the ISTF community, it is my pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the opening session of ISTF Yale 2021. And as you know, ISTF is a diverse community of academics, practitioners, Indigenous leaders, forest community members, policymakers, storytellers, and just a global community of individuals with the interest of tropical forests at the center. We've developed some ways for you to keep connected as a community. So these include the website profiles that Dewi was mentioning. We have some networking events. And we want to point out that this website that looks fantastic this year and has the functionality of creating this sense of community is in great efforts from Mike Slattery here at YSE. So a big thank you to Mike for doing so. So finally, with one more gentle reminder to stay muted, I would like to say it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Florencia Montagnini, who will open the 2021 and 27th annual Yale ISTF conference, before we then move on to our opening keynote address by Dr. William Karesh of EcoHealth Alliance. Dr. Florencia Montagnini is a senior research scientist and director of the Yale School of Environment's program in tropical forestry and agroforestry. Florencia's research focuses on the variables that control the sustainability of managed ecosystems, with an emphasis on tropical systems. She studied forest tree plantations, both native and mixed species, and agroforestry systems. Sustainable land use systems, including their integration of ecological principles with economic, social, and political factors, and the principles and applications of forest landscape restoration on degraded lands. Florencia has also contributed to the identification and quantification of ecosystem services, including biodiversity, carbon sequestration, and watershed protection. And she has promoted both the restoration and conservation of these same services through the use of payments for ecosystem services. She has worked to have biodiversity conservation, organic farming techniques, and indigenous knowledge integrated into human-dominated landscapes. And her research has contributed to the field through 11 books on agroforestry systems and ecological restoration, and more than 250 scientific articles. At YSE and more generally within the tropical forest research community, she teaches, she advises, and she's a mentor in courses on agroforestry, landscape restoration, soil conservation, and management. And here at YSE, we're not the only ones who recognize her. She also holds honorary professorships at several universities across Latin America. And in her spare time, if she has any, she also works as a consultant advising projects using her expertise in tropical forestry, agroforestry, and rural development across the world. Welcome, Dr. Montagnini.
Well, thank you very much, Alicia, for such a nice presentation. It's such a pleasure to be here today, such an honor to be here. I'm going to share my screen to show you a few things that I put together for presentation. Where is it now? Welcome here. Is it? Yeah, it's right there. Okay, so I need to get to the full screen. So you have it right there?
It looks excellent.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, yes, so it's such a pleasure to be here today to give you the welcome address of the 27th. Imagine that. International Society of Tropical Foresters Conference. And let me tell you that I have been, I think, through all of them because I have been at Yale since 1989, so long enough to witness this incredible effort. It's the there are only two chapters, two student chapters of the International Society of Tropical Foresters, and this is the only chapter, the Yale chapter, that has been doing an annual conference, which is totally student-run for now 27 years. And it's incredible how the subjects of the conferences real match what's happening in the world, in our environment, in our forests. And it means that really our community of students and faculty and everyone else is really aware of what's happening, and we all do together to try to make a change. So that's why I was so pleased when they started talking about this conference and to call it timelines and critical junctures, re-examining crises as opportunities for change. Because what could be better than this juncture where we are in today, between the pandemic and overpopulation and all the human issues that happen around the world? How can be a better title? So for the welcome address, I said to myself, I shouldn't be talking about agroforestry or biodiversity or soils because you have heard enough about it. So that's what I did, is to put for motivating you, few pictures that signify all that: agroforestry, biodiversity, creating islands of biodiversity in human-dominated landscapes. So now I'm done with it. So now we can go to the next slide and go on with our presentation. And as you say, a picture is worth 1,000 words. So I said it all there. So just to let you know, and we already know that this is our first ever virtual conference. So it's a bummer because we won't get the free lunches and all that. But it's actually at the same time, it's a real advantage because it allows participants to connect. And you see connect has there like a click. So if you go to the agenda and you see where it says connect, you'll be connecting with everything. It's not just the website. Now you are seeing this presentation, but there is all kinds of things that you can do to connect even more through networking sessions, using Zoom, using the spatial chat. So please go ahead and use all those resources because you'll be connecting every time. And not only that, but then days like today, they're announcing bad weather. I remember some ISTF conferences where the ice and the snow, because they're always in January or February, and some people couldn't park. So you're avoiding all that. So those are one of the advantages of being virtual. Plus, we get people from all over the world to be able to connect. The only limiting thing there is if there is any connecting issues, but generally they are not. In this time of IT, people are so smart and they are able to connect with almost every device that they have, so that won't be a problem. And we have, because of that too, because we have a record number of registrants, over 300. And I was writing that this morning in my slides, doing last minute changes. And then I got an email from Dewi saying 360. And she said, that's 7 a.m. So it's growing. I'm sure it's growing as we speak. And we have, again, as an advantage of being a virtual conference, we have more than 25 speakers from around the world. This is something that we need to say, again, an advantage of being virtual this time, because some places are so remote and some people wouldn't be able to attend. So now we have them here because we're virtual. And we're going to have, among just to highlight a couple of them, the ones that we're going to see today. We are going to see William Karesh, the Executive Vice President for Health and Policy for EcoHealth Alliance. He will be giving the opening address just in a few minutes. And then for the closing address, we'll have Sunita Narayan, Director General of Center for Science and the Environment. So that will be on Saturday. So why then we said that the headline crisis of 2019 and 2020, and they're ongoing. I added this now because this is still ongoing. We only artificially say this is the end of the year. Actually, things continue minute by minute. Forest fires in the Amazon, Congo Basin, and Australia. Those were highlights in the news, in the media. They were highlights of 2019 and 2020. But things don't stop. Things keep happening. Climate change, the COVID-19 pandemic, it's now over a year that we have the COVID-19 pandemic. So those things have captured the global attention. And when we know that, we're all very aware of that. But is everyone aware that all these long-term chronic crises that we have are the result of years of tropical forest degradation, biodiversity loss, socioeconomic and environmental justice? Is everyone aware of that? I'm not sure, because many people can talk about some things, maybe the socio-political environment, all that, but I'm not sure the everyday, in an everyday conversation, a regular person will think about how everything depends on the forest and tropical forest degradation, and especially the tropical forest. And you know that that's the case, because that's how many of the zoonotic diseases, or diseases that are where there is an intermediary there, which is an animal or an insect, a mammal or an insect, are originating in the tropical forest. And if you think about, because of human intrusion in the tropical forest, because human intervention in the tropical forest, diseases that we have been dealing with for the longest time, like malaria, leishmaniasis, leptospirosis, pyroplasmosis, and all those oses that we had not so long ago, about maybe 10, 15 years, our school had a project in collaboration with the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health of Yale University, and we were studying what we were calling arboviruses, meaning arthropod-borne viruses, and they are actually transmitted through insects who bite a little animal in the forest, and then the cycle stays in the forest, and nothing would happen if people wouldn't come near the forest. So the diseases get actually domesticated as people come into the forest, and then they come back to their residency, which is maybe in a peri-urban location in some tropical country. Then those diseases get accommodated there, they acclimated there, and that's when they can spread as pandemics. In the cases of leishmaniasis, malaria, they are diseases that we as humans are still fighting, but we know the answers, at least some of the answers, although some things are still killing people worldwide. But something like the COVID-19 happened in exactly the same way. The human intrusion in the forest, more and more people getting into the forest for satisfying their needs. That's what we need to find solutions for. So this is, again, things that have happened following the COVID-19 crisis, and also as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic: illegal deforestation in indigenous Amazonian territories, including Ecuador, Brazil, unprecedented forest loss, increasing fire risk, carbon emissions. So this conference is intended then to make people aware, us, who are many of you are the decision makers of the future and of the present times, to intend to engage everyone, engage in our efforts to try to increase efforts to try to mitigate these problems. So this is what we're going to be seeing during the conference, and this is where we're going to be addressing those specific issues that I just told you about. First, we're going to have a panel, which is for today, Tropical Forest Crisis, a global discussion in a pandemic year. I'm so glad that we're bringing some good friends to it. Dennis Garrity, I have known for years. Javier Mateo Vega, I have known him for years. And other people, I'm sorry, sometimes I don't remember their names, but I'm sure I've seen them before. The second panel will be on the second day, reflecting on crisis narratives in force, anthropological perspectives. It's an amazing group of people of whom I know some of them very well. And the last one on Saturday, it says Data Plus, which is like kind of mysterious name, but it's not as mysterious when you look at what are the people who are composing that panel. It's amazing, reframing the role of data in addressing environmental changes. And we also have a great closing lined up with the IRI launch and the Bomba performance by Movimiento Cultural, which I expect will have nice music and nice dancing. We can do some virtual dancing. So I will then leave you next with the opening keynote that will be given by William Karesh, One Health in an Era of Pandemics. And as I said before, he's the Executive Vice President for Health and Policy for EcoHealth Alliance. After that, we'll have a break, and then we'll have the first panel presentations, Tropical Forest Crisis, a global discussion in a pandemic year. It will be about an hour and 15 minutes. There will be a break, a panel followed by the panel discussion, then the lunch break, and then it continues through the day and the rest of the days. So thank you very much and enjoy the conference.
Thank you so much, Professor Montagnini, for starting us off with such a wonderful welcome address. I can really feel your positive energy radiating through the Zoom channels. And today we're very lucky to have our keynote speaker, Dr. Karesh, at this year's conference. Dr. Karesh is an internationally recognized expert on infectious disease, wildlife, and the environment. He's currently the Executive Vice President for Health and Policy at EcoHealth Alliance and is a member of the World Health Organization's International Health Regulations roster of experts. He also serves as the president of the World Organization for Animal Health Working Group on Wildlife. And in 2003, he coined the term One Health to describe the interdependence of healthy ecosystems, animals, and people. And the term has been adopted by many organizations, including the United Nations and the World Bank, in both local and global health efforts. Dr. Karesh has pioneered in dozens of initiatives to encourage linkages among public health, agriculture, and environmental health agencies and organizations across the world. And very shortly, we'll be hearing from Dr. Karesh on his keynote titled One Health in the Era of Pandemics, plural there. We will also have a Q&A session after his presentation. I encourage you to use the chat box to type any questions you have during the presentation. Afterwards, we will be opening the floor for Q&A, and so you can also use the raise your hand function, and we'll call on you in order. It would also be nice to hear where you're coming from when you ask your question, so that we know where you're from, and also like just to see how beautiful this conference has taken place across various time zones. And that's it for me. Dr. Karesh, please take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be here. Greetings, everyone. We've got a great group from around the world I can see here on the screen. In some ways, I think my little background slide, I just realized, is probably tells the whole story of what I'd like to talk about today. But I'm not going to do that because I'm going to show you lots of other slides and lots of other illustrations to kind of support what I'd like to talk to you about. But I think in the end, we'll get back to this photograph if we have time, and you'll see how that all fits together. And this is in the state of Sabah in Malaysia, with some land, tropical forest, and cleared for palm oil, agricultural production, and communities behind me. So I will just jump in here. In some ways, I'm sorry that we are meeting virtually. I would have loved to be able to say that I went to Yale, but now I can't say. I've only gone to Yale now virtually. I can't tell people that I went to Yale. So I think One Health, and lots of people have different definitions about what health is, and I'd like to present mine to you and let you see how it really fits into the work. It's really founded in in the types of work all of you do, and I hope I get that point across to you. We tend to think of emerging infectious diseases and pandemics as medical problems. We at EcoHealth Alliance have a little different view on that, and we like to use science to kind of guide our thinking about where to go in the future and what can be done about this. When we take a look at emerging infectious disease events over the last 50, 60 years now, we start to compile that data, you have a map of the world that looks like this. And traditionally in the medical profession, I was trained in that world. We do retrospective looks at surveillance data or reporting data and try to come to some conclusion, often very biased, of course. In the case of emerging infectious disease events, this map of where emerging diseases have taken place is a very biased, of course, based on where there's reporting, where there's the capability to make a diagnosis, where there's interest in doing studies. So you have an academic bias, a resource-based bias, a language bias that really skews the picture of where emerging disease events begin. This is actually where they originate, and some, if not many, end up being resulting in pandemics, and that just has to do with the global spread. But when we look at what are the underlying factors, what's the background at each of these individual events, we get a very different picture. So we can correct for the reporting bias and we can correct for the diagnostic bias, and look at what is, one way, people want to call in the environmental world drivers. In the medical world, we talk about them as risk factors, and that has to do with correlation versus causality. This is more really about correlations. What we see that pulls these events together is that the vast majority, the largest number, have to do with land use change. And then we have things like agricultural production, industry change, food industry change. And of course, the pandemic component has a lot to do with international travel and commerce. But even the origins of these emerging disease events, by their definition, an emerging infectious disease is either a new disease, which we're seeing with COVID-19, or an old disease occurring in a new place, like we saw with Zika virus a few years ago coming into the Western Hemisphere. So there's where the travel and commerce come into play with the emerging disease. And then other things kind of fall in. There's a long list of categories. What this approach does, and what we try to push for, is to take an objective look based on real data, rather than where people have done their favorite study subject. And then they claim that what they study is the root cause of emerging diseases or pandemics. So you hear a lot of that on the wildlife trade, and we'll get into that. And I myself, spent decades looking at the wildlife trade and the relationship to emerging infectious diseases. So I was very biased that way until when I started really looking at the numbers that came out and see that actually plays a smaller role. So that's where I get back to the work you're doing in the environmental sciences. That world and land management is really the underpinnings of our health. And it's certainly where we need to intervene when we're starting to think about to reduce the risk of emerging diseases and pandemics. And hopefully I'll remember to get back to that when we finish. If we map the risk factors or those drivers, instead of mapping the disease events, if we map the underlying correlates, the risk factors, we get a different view of the world. And that's what we call the hotspots of emerging infectious diseases. So we can look forward instead of retrospectively. We want to be able to look forward if we're going to do anything about this in the future, about where's the highest risk. So this is a heat map, it's relative risk. Parts of the world are higher risk of a disease emerging than other parts of the world. And it's based on that slide I showed you before about where are those activities, where are those human activities. This is a very anthropogenically driven system about disease emergence, and where are those activities taking place. And that's where we want to focus our efforts. If we're going to do anything to reduce the number of emerging diseases occurring, reduce the number of pandemics, reduce the burden of disease for people. we've taken a look at like what are that system of health security, I guess we could call it that, you know, what are these supporting functions? And then the kind of the medical world, the response world to epidemics and pandemics, kind of come up with these basic categories. We've been rolling this out for government agencies to think a little more broadly about this kind of component of prevention, detection, responding, and recovering. The middle two frequently, because epidemics, emerging diseases, pandemics are generally considered to be a health sector problem, a health problem, a medical problem, and the medical world is very good about focusing on detection and responding. The medical world is not really heavily invested in prevention and recovery, but these are all linked and they all have to be addressed if we're going to have a healthier world. And when we actually went and started asking about where's the money going, I always say talk is cheap, but if you really want to know what priorities are, you look at organizations' budgets. Where do they put their money? And when we start to look at where the investments are, where are global financial resources, where they're put, it really does highlight the fact that the money is basically spent on response. So when we have a crisis, there's a lot of money thrown at resolving the crisis. Very little investments in preventing or early detection, and very little investments in recovery from them. People move on, they forget about it. That recovery phase is about resilience and building resilience, which is really part of prevention for the next crises. So there's a very circular, I'm sorry, it looks like it flows from left to right, but it's a circular system. And we really need to focus on that recovery, build back better, which has turned out to be a interesting political term recently. I think you're all hearing that, but it really builds into this idea of recovery and prevention for the future. But there's not much money put into prevention. And I think once again, it's because we've disconnected the medical world from the rest of the world that really underpins why we have disease emergence and pandemics in general. They've been separated. And that's what I start to think about. That's my view of One Health. I know everybody talks about infectious diseases or zoonotic diseases or, isn't that interesting, animals and humans share diseases. Well, I guess it's kind of interesting if you really have never thought about evolution or ecology, then it would be fascinating. But it's just obvious. It's an obvious concept, but it's also easy for people to understand. The more complex one is how the other sectors of society are really involved in protecting and ensuring our health. And we don't invite that group. We tend to reserve that as a medical situation. So I'm going to use COVID-19 and this SARS coronavirus just as an example to illustrate it, because it's kind of fresh in everybody's mind. We're all still dealing with it right now, and hence why we're meeting virtually and not in New Haven or someplace else nice that we could get together. So we've been looking at SARS-related coronavirus since the first SARS outbreak, it was 15 years ago or so, about where are these viruses, where do they live, what's their natural history, what's the ecology of these viruses. And in the process of doing that, we're finding hundreds of related viruses. I mean, now up to 500 coronaviruses just in bats alone, different viruses, basically species of viruses, but distinct viruses in bats in southern China, in the kind of region of southern China and across the borders. There's 500 viruses that have never been described before. At least 100 of those fall into this group of these related to SARS. So we call them SARS-related viruses, related to either SARS-1 or now we have SARS coronavirus 2. And you can see, and I don't want to spend time on a phylogenetic tree, but you can see this large pool of viruses that are just circulating in nature. And this has been going on, of course, for thousands and thousands of years, since the dawn of time. So viruses actually preceded vertebrates. So we had viruses long before the vertebrates evolved, way long before there were mammals. And so there's a long history of viruses in our world. What does that mean? Why are they circulating and why are they getting into people? So kind of our approach, some people would say, oh, this is the One Health approach by integrating studies across animals and people in the environment. I'm happy if you want to use it that way, that's fine with me. We kind of take that as a standard approach to disease ecology or infectious disease ecology. The work was really done in southern China, sampling bats. So that's how we end up with a large genetic phylogenetic tree with hundreds of bat viruses and coronaviruses or other viruses in bats. So you're kind of sampling across 3 provinces across southern China, and you start to indicate there what we're finding. Then the next step was actually identifying which bat roosts, which cave systems, which trees, which colonies of bats, the ones that are colonial, seem to have a higher prevalence of coronaviruses, and then go work in those areas more specifically with people, with human populations that we a priori decided are more at risk of being exposed to the viruses from the bats, and doing studies with those people about their behavior, the anthropological component, and then of course a biological component about their exposure and using serology and testing them. What we found was that people living in those areas range from 0.5% to 3% of all the people that we were looking at were serology positive to these coronaviruses. So you extrapolate that out, you're talking about thousands and thousands of people in these communities prior to COVID-19, this is from 2017, were already seropositive to these group of viruses. So this fact about viruses being shared, especially coronaviruses between bats and humans, has been going on for quite some time. Dare I say, it's always been going on since the history of humanity and exposure to bats. When we look out and take a kind of an ecological look and say, well, what's the distribution of those bats? What's the geographic distribution of those bats? And where are people exposed, where the human populations overlaid with the bat populations? We start to see, we can estimate, between using that same percentage, probably between 3 million and 20 million people are already serologically positive to these coronaviruses leading into this pandemic. So it's a vast number of people. This gives us a little different insight into, well, how could something like COVID-19 happen? Well, it happens because it only takes one of these people, one of those 20 million people, for that virus to be adapted for rapid human-to-human transmission. Of these estimated 3 million to 20 million people that are serologically positive, obviously most of them picked up the virus, their immune system fought it off. It went away within a week or two. They may never have given it to another person. Those were dead ends for the virus jump to people, as we talk about viruses jumping between animals and people or among species. Most of those are dead end jumps. They jump in the deep end of the pool and they drown and don't make it. But it only takes one or two to survive and evolve and mutate to become readily transmissible from person to person. So really the thing that's surprising is that we don't see it more often. I think it is happening a lot more often, but most of them just go unrecognized. I don't know anybody of all my friends, and I'd be surprised if any of you before a year ago, if you had a little respiratory infection and you went and saw your medical practitioner, it's very rare for them to take a swab and send it out for genetic sequencing. It's never happened in my whole lifetime. My doctor has never taken a swab from me and genetically sequenced it until this year when I got a COVID test. So we have, several 8 billion people, 7 billion, 8 billion people on this planet. We get respiratory infections. No one actually figures out what those are on a daily basis. So this is going on. And what we just don't see is some of those becoming severe enough to become a pandemic spread and cause enough mortality to interest us. So what can we do about that? Well, there are some things we can do about it, and I want to get into some of that, but the most obvious one I want to do, given the bat world of this interaction with bats and people, is really educate people and work with local communities and use that anthropology kind of look at why people are doing what they're doing, what are their risk factors, why are they being exposed. In that part of the world where we were doing that study, people go into caves frequently. There's a lot of tourism for caves. Some are religious shrines. In the tourist site, you can actually go in. Some are beautiful. You walk through the caves. We do that in the United States too. There's cave tourism. There's restaurants there outside the cave where the bats fly in and out. There's vendors and stalls with people selling things, and there's food. So there's a lot of potential for exposure. And of course, when the bats fly out of these caves, if they are cave-dwelling bats, there's a plume when they leave, and that they are shedding urine and feces. And coronaviruses in bats, and most mammals, is a gastrointestinal infection. And when we pick up coronaviruses in bats, we pick them up in urine and feces. We don't have to do a respiratory swab. So kind of a natural history of these viruses in bats is they're shed frequently in urine and feces. There's a lot of opportunity for people to be exposed over time because we know there's billions of bats and there's billions of people. What can we do in communities to engage them and educate them? We can come out, and we've done some booklets. These are like cartoon books, but we go to small communities. We're doing this in Africa, and South America, and Asia, working with local communities. How could they live safely with bats? Because the first reaction tends to be, well, let's just kill the bats, of course. That's a human-dominated solution. Like we often do with vector control, mosquito control. Let's just kill all the mosquitoes. That's now been applied to larger animals. Let's just kill all the bats, and then we won't have a problem anymore. Well, if we killed all the bats, we wouldn't actually have tropical forests. That would be a unfortunate outcome of that approach. Nonetheless, first response of humans is to try and place blame on someone or something and then try to kill it. So we have thousands of years of history of doing that, unfortunately. What we're trying to do is encourage people to understand the value of bats and how they can live safely with bats and reduce their exposure. And that's really what we're talking about, is risk reduction strategies and coming up with that. The other thing that's come out with COVID-19, and which I think some people are getting the message, which is good, is that this transmission is two ways. So we also, now that we have hundreds of millions of people infected with this virus that we know can infect animals, there's a really opportunity for spill back into animal populations. So part of our responsibility has now become also, it's not talked about a lot, but also to protect wildlife populations and domestic animal populations from getting the human form of the virus spilling back. We know some species are uniquely susceptible just from evidence to date. We are concerned that the virus could get into bat populations in different parts of the world and get established. And that could be done by researchers actually, or spelunkers, people going into caves, exposing bats, maybe bat rehabilitators, exposing them and releasing them. But we don't really want to establish new reservoirs around the world. That's what we did with plague. That has not worked out well. So plague has a relationship with rodents and their fleas. It started in one part of the world, and humans have spread it all around the world. And now we have plague basically globally distributed. And wherever humans took the disease, it got established in a new wildlife population that was local. So now we have plague in North America, in the Western Hemisphere. It's found its own reservoirs. We'd like to avoid doing that over and over again. We'd like to not do that with COVID-19 and establish new reservoirs in wild animals. We've seen the big problem in mink, of course, that's really well documented. Raccoon dogs, that's not a raccoon on the left, that's a raccoon dog. And that's a species that's distributed all the way from East Asia, all the way now into Scandinavia. It's got a very extensive range. It's People who think that's related to climate change, that they've been really able to, it's a good generalist species. It's expanded its range. They're very susceptible to COVID-19, SARS-CoV-2, and they spread it amongst themselves very effectively there. They're also farmed extensively. That's an animal that's used commonly in fur farming in Asia. A lot of you that might buy a kind of a inexpensive fur fashion item with a fur collar, many of those are, much of that is raccoon dog farm raised in Asia. So we have to be thinking about that. In the US, we've actually even started vaccinating black-footed ferrets in captivity for the captive program to protect them from getting human infection. So you see this kind of interrelatedness and the circular nature of some of the problems that we as human beings are creating. That kind of leads us into the wet markets and wildlife trade. This comes up every time we have an emerging diseases issue. That is because about 75% of emerging infectious diseases are linked back to wildlife. It's not really the wildlife's fault, it's what we do about wildlife. So on the left, you see a market there with bats. Those are fruit bats for sale in a market, and you see the level of contact between people and the bats and the viscera and the blood. So the opportunity on a daily basis in this kind of a market system is pretty high. You have hundreds of millions of people on a daily basis visiting some kind of farmer's market, wet market type situation every day on a weekly basis. Once again, it only takes one opportunity for a virus to move from this situation to human. And when we're talking about hundreds of millions of people doing this on a routine basis, you really talking about buying hundreds of millions of lottery tickets if you're a virus, and your chances of winning and making that successful leap are pretty good. The other part of the wet markets and the animal trade are live animal markets in general. So that's on the right is chickens, and of course with chickens we have to think about influenza. And in these market systems, you have a mixing of species, and you'll hear more about this in the next week or so from the investigation from Wuhan. That'll come out in the WHO report in the next week or two about this kind of mix of species in this market. When they're dead, of course, you have a risk from the dead, bloody animals in a market. But viruses don't grow well in dead animals. By definition, a virus needs to be in a living cell. They're not really independent organisms. So it's really live animals that produce a much higher risk for viral emergence, viral mutation, viral spread in a market system where you have a mix of species. They're each shedding their viruses. You have an opportunity for cross-species transmission of the viruses inside the animal system. And then that allows for changes that may make it less or more likely or less likely to infect humans, more pathogenic or less pathogenic. Remember, evolution goes in all of those directions. We only see the ones that become more infectious and more pathogenic. The ones that are evolving in the other direction, we never realized they ever existed. We miss all of that. So we're very biased in what we see. We always think that everything evolves to become more deadly. That's actually the rare case. What can we do? We have to help people move away from these systems. So as countries have developed, they've moved into cleaner food systems. This is unfortunately a product of a lack of investment, a lack of development, a lack of opportunity to move into cleaner systems. We've been doing some really fun work now with liquid natural gas facilities to build refrigeration into capturing the waste energy from when liquid natural gas is gasified, when it's regasified for use in oil, for electricity production or any type of LNG use. It has to be regasified. Currently, that energy is wasted when it goes from a liquid to a gas. Of course, it's extremely cold. That kind of cold energy is just released into the environment or into water. There are now systems in place where you're using that for cold storage and refrigeration. So you have electricity-free cold storage and refrigeration. So you've got carbon neutral or very low carbon impact that. These are opportunities, and we're talking about kind of these crises presenting new opportunities to kind of rethink what we're doing. This is a facility in South Korea, and this group, Orbit Holdings, they're actually building their second facility. You see solar panels on the roof. At the port of entry where the liquid natural gas comes into the country, instead of being just regasified and wasted, they run it through the cold storage facility where it turns to gas. But that process then, of course, chills everything down. So you can use this for food, you can use this for electronic products. Of course, cold storage has a lot of benefits. We're thinking about it as an alternative, I'm calling it kind of chilling for health, to reduce live animal markets. So we can see another co-benefit about getting people out of the system of moving billions of animals alive to markets around the world by using low carbon footprint refrigeration. Now we still need some innovation for smaller units, for small holders. But with refrigeration, we can reduce food waste by 30%. So that's reducing carbon footprints there. We can reduce, of course, as I mentioned, disease risk. And then we can reduce carbon footprint. So we kind of have this multiple co-benefits from thinking across at a more systemic level, coming up with some engineering solutions, reducing our impact on the environment, and then having this benefit of reducing the risk of emerging infectious diseases. So I just kind of wanted to finish up and get back to what I was starting with you before about these drivers or risk factors and why you fit in here. When we really do, this is that same table, except now we're doing it as a pie chart, and you see that large chunk of these risk factors for disease emergence and hence pandemics are really related to deforestation, and we're a little biased, and reforestation also carries risk. So it's really about land use change and agricultural intensification, agricultural change, habitat change are all linked with what we see with disease emergence. And then of course our food systems, how do you feed 7 or 8 billion people on the planet? What's tended to happen, and I think, I love the theme of your conference here about these crises, about new opportunities. I think traditionally, by working independently, people have come up with some great simple solutions, like how do we produce more food? Well, we can intensify production systems to produce a lot of food more cheaply. But in isolation, that's a great idea. But no one looked at the collateral damage caused by this because it wasn't a multi-sectoral approach to thinking through what that was. And no one was told they were told to, grow more food. They weren't told grow more food, but cause no harm. So I think what we're doing here now in the 21st century is thinking a little more completely about what we need to be doing. And of course, it makes it more complicated. If it was easy, we would have already solved the problem. So what we're kind of leaving you to deal with are the more complicated problems. And I trust you're going to do great. Just to put it in a perspective for the 10,000 years, our world is really different. Some people really kind of have trouble or don't agree with this, but this is kind of like the vertebrate land, the mass of vertebrate land animals. Oceans are a whole nother issue, and we could spend another time talking about that. But you see, humans have changed the face of the planet, and it used to be a place where it was wild places and wild animals, and not very many people 10,000 years ago. And today we have billions of people. So it's estimated a third of the vertebrate biomass on the planet, not insects, of course, but the vertebrate biomass is humans, and the rest are livestock, and wild animals aren't there much. And we have changed the face of the planet. We have not changed the laws of evolution. We have not changed the rules or the principles of ecology. Those are still at play. What we've changed is the playing field. So the world is a different place, and the laws of nature are still the same. And that's why we're seeing disease emergence and pandemics, because those rules are still at play, and it was just a new playing field. We have really disrupted the surface of the planet by our activities. So we have to really get into that. So there's been some good reports coming out. I think there's some bigger thinking coming out. This is the IPBES report, really looking at land degradation restoration and how that relates to health outcomes. So we're kind of starting to see a widening of thinking about human health or animal health and how it relates to the environment. And I think this is going to be the most important shift we can do in the 21st century, is to rethink what health is really about and why we need to be working upstream and why other parts of society have to be invited to the health discussion, hence One Health. The health does not belong to the medical profession. Health belongs to all of society, and we all have to be engaged because all of our activities are driving what's happening with health outcomes. So we see land use cover. Once again, this is a really well done report that's come out recently with climate change. I don't know what happened on the left there, but we kind of take a broader look at what's happening with climate change. And once again, we can see that there are ultimately health outcomes from this. We all know this and we've all heard about this. But as you tease it apart, you can start to see where we need to take action to reduce some of the contributing factors for climate change. Once again, that's land, agriculture, power production, that's an obvious one, food production. And then where are places we can start to target interventions ultimately for a health outcome. If all we're going to do is try and treat the people after they get sick, if you think back to where the medical world invests in responses, you basically what you have is the medical community being basically the garbage collectors. So what you have is a medical profession that's just trying to clean up the mess from the rest of society. And that is why we're not making much progress anymore. And that's why we need an integrated approach. And that's why everyone needs to be thinking that they are a health professional, even if they're an engineer that designs cooling systems. They need to be part of the health solution. They are health professionals too. So we've come to really try to change the thinking on funding, where I talked about where's the money going. We've been working with the World Bank to kind of bring in this principle of One Health and where the World Bank starts to invest their money. And they have a complex system. This is kind of, I think all of you will find yourself inserting yourself somewhere in this during your careers, and you might move from bubble to bubble, but there's an educational and training component and experts, and some people are more into planning, some more people are more into policy and frameworks, and these all fit together. It's initially seems to be confusing and people have trouble differentiating and where they should invest their energy. And we really try to lay some of this out in a way, kind of a roadmap of what needs to be done, where people can make a difference in different ways and how it ties together. So we need a more unified approach and a larger systems thinking. I know some of you enjoy that. Some of you probably more happy about going out and doing field work. There's a role there too. We have to do all of that, and it has to be pulled together. At national levels, we're finally starting to see there's some opportunities for coordination. So the World Health Organization does their external evaluation for capacity to prevent pandemics, but we have some people working on antimicrobial resistance. Not many people are thinking about the environmental components of that. That needs to be done. There's biodiversity action plans. Rarely have these been pulled together at countries. Everybody works separately and sometimes at odds with each other. So even the Millennial Development Goals, when you start to look at the UN, the big goals or development goals, some of them are completely at odds with each other. But that's because they were developed by different groups of people with different levels of interest. That has to be pulled together. We think it tends to come together at national level. It's hard globally, but countries could get organized to do this. And then I just wanted to finish with, I hope what you've been hearing me say, and you've heard about the greatest generation. And I'm too young. I missed the greatest generation. I'm too young. It was kind of my parents, grandparents' generation. So I don't get to claim being part of the greatest generation, but a bunch of people, and they went around the world and shot each other and stopped wars and invented things and built the interstate highway system in the US and cleared all the forests and made chickens really cheap. And you start to wonder, I don't want to take anything away from that, but it was a simpler time where you could almost just use brute force to create great, big change. I don't know if it was great change, but big change. And it did a lot of important things. So I didn't get to participate in that. And now I'm too old to be in the greatest generation of the 21st century. That's you. So I'm looking to you to take this on. And as I mentioned before, I think these problems are big and complex. And if they weren't, we would have solved them in the 20th century. If they were easy, the easy stuff's been done. I'm sorry to tell you, the easy stuff's been done. The difficult stuff lies ahead of us, and that's for you. But I think you can do it because all of you are thinking differently than the previous generation. You really are thinking about collateral benefits, about not being successful in one place just to be detrimental to another group of people or another place. So I think your thinking, the way you've come up in life, is a much broader, healthier way to view the world than any of us were raised. So I think you'll do it. And I see this is kind of the next greatest generation. This is a field team in South Africa. I see a different approach happening, and I'm really excited about it. I'm counting on you. And please let me know if I can help you in any way. And so I wanted to finish that, and you can be in touch, and there's my email. And then I'll stop sharing because I think I've spoken enough. And we can have a conversation if there's time. And I would urge you to ask really, use the system and ask some really difficult questions. If you ask easy questions, it's not going to be a very interesting conversation. So let's get into some awkward and uncomfortable things. I think we'll have a better conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karesh, for such an insightful presentation. I just want to quickly highlight Heather, who has been doing the visualizations, and Mariana would spotlight her. Can all take a moment to appreciate how she has summarized this Dr. Karesh's presentation. And please feel free to either type your question or raise your hand, and we will call on you. And we have a few questions that have came in already, but I'm going to start to get the audience warmed up by asking you, Dr. Karesh, in your opinion, what are some of the biggest social and political failings that make COVID-19 one of the most widespread and dangerous diseases as compared to other diseases that you've mentioned?
The biological side of it is the fact that it's spread by respiratory transmission. So that just instantly changes, the storyline. So then it's like a influenza or the common cold viruses, some of which are coronaviruses. So they are just really easily transmitted. When we get in vector-borne diseases, tend not to, it's very rare to have a pandemic from a vector-borne disease because the biology actually requires the presence of a vector. So things like Zika virus coming into the Western Hemisphere, that really only happened because the vector is an invasive alien species. That mosquito was introduced, years prior. So, that was a combination event. Those are much more rare. So just biologically. And then socially, it's been interesting to see where, societal, cultural commitment, I don't know really how to describe it. I'm not an anthropologist, but you can see where society has come together. They've done there's more unity of purpose. They've done a better job. In New Zealand, Australia's done a good job. Korea originally did a good job. Parts of the world were more comfortable wearing a face mask because they've been doing it for many years. So it's a more natural transition. I think that helped get things under control. Parts of the world, society, culturally, there's more trust of government and leadership. So you get more compliance. And culturally in the US, we have a long tradition of independence and not, wanting to be told what to do in this country. So that is something how it works against us. We weren't inspired to pull together on that. And so it varies. So you see, but I do think, there's a tremendous cultural component. Given that, it would still be difficult to control. And we've seen these, we have two common cold viruses, 3 or so caused by coronaviruses, 2 of which look like they came from bats one in the 1700s, one in the 1900s, and became a common cold virus. And we don't really have good data on when that happened in the 1700s, how many people originally died, and if that virus changed to be less deadly, but it's still circulating today. So these things happen. In influenza from 1917, 1918, that strain is still circulating today. That's our, flu still has the genetic components from the 1918 strain. So they don't go away. And this one, COVID-19 is not going to go away either. So at some point we need to pull together and get this organized. And it's kind of sad that, that the first response, I was at the WHO meetings there, and the first response from the medical community, of course, was we need to focus our money on treating sick people, because we really think about medicine now as more about individual medicine than we do about public health and preventing people from getting sick. The big focus is on the money, and the profits are made on treating sick people. And then of course the other is, well, let's make a vaccine. And we've done a remarkable job in making a vaccine, but I don't think we can, that world also is a very expensive approach to vaccinate yourself out of every new disease, because we're going to constantly have new diseases, and the vaccines are expensive and they only work really for one bug. So you kind of like one bug, one drug, next bug, next drug, next bug, next drug, and you're always behind the curve because we're not really investing in things that would reduce risk or prevent them. So I think at some point we have to change the thinking. And once again, I hope you are the people that help demand that and then make that happen.
Yeah, no, those are really, really great provocative points. And that's why your language about One Health just really encapsulates this whole complexity of the issue. And, reframing public health in the environmental sector is as important as just treating the COVID-19 as a disaster. And you also mentioned that because of reframing it sometimes in a disaster, there are pros and cons of it, because a lot of it could go into response and not preventative care. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the pros and cons of sometimes, reframing public health in certain sectors that could have pros and cons of in ways people respond to such a crisis.
Could you steer me a little more in the direction there?
So for instance, similarly to like an earthquake or a tsunami, right? That the category of disaster can often have certain cons, because all of the money that's being poured into it is not preventative, but in response. And so I'm just wondering, in your experience with COVID-19, because you're on the frontier of this, and when you go to big development organizations and conferences, and when you try to push this reframing of One Health, and often gets lumped into, like public health could, for instance, get lumped into disaster, or it could get lumped into land use planning. Like sometimes what are the pros and cons?
Okay. That's a great question. And yeah, I'm a big advocate of thinking through this work as part of a disaster risk reduction framework. And there are, all countries have kind of participate in that. And at an international level, there's a UN, ISDCR. So there's a system in place about disaster risk reduction framework. Traditionally, that has been earthquakes, tsunamis, floods. And the health community was invited, participated in that because those events were seen to have secondary adverse health outcomes. So after the flood, they have cholera, or after the tsunami, there's cholera or malaria outbreak. So you need some doctors there. And there's a whole profession that kind of comes around humanitarian relief, medical relief, post-disaster medical relief. But the conversation was never about reducing risk of disasters in order to have health benefits or reduce disease. That's a more conversation, and I don't think it's catching hold. We've been going to some of those kind of high-level meetings to discuss it. Everybody nods their head, but I think the challenge is most people are more comfortable staying in their own lane and working in their own field. And in the medical field in general, it's hard to get medical professionals to get, they've been trained, we've been trained, with us, you should focus on your specialty. You're really good at what you know. You need to respect don't get outside of your area of specialty, your board certification. And there's a lot of benefits to that. I mean, I do want, if I ever need brain surgery, I would like a board certified brain surgeon. I would like a specialist to do that on me. I don't want, a podiatrist doing my brain surgery. So we do need specialization, but we need to somehow find ways to also, work outside that and work across and work with each other. On that disaster risk reduction, it fits with pandemic risk reduction. We won't prevent earthquakes, but we have identified, using good science, we have identified where earthquakes are more likely to happen. And what has been taking place in many of those places is we've engineered solutions to reduce the impact of earthquakes. So we have building codes and engineering codes and building codes in places that are higher risk for earthquakes. The building codes are different than they are in places where are lower risk for earthquakes. And that building code saves lives because buildings all just don't collapse instantly. And where you have parts of the world that don't do that, you still see horrible outcomes from earthquakes because they don't have the money, they don't have the financing, they don't have the political will in many cases to shift in that direction. Same with fire prevention. We have engineered solutions to making sure New York, I live in New York, I'm looking out, New York does not burn down every 2 years because we have engineered fire prevention into building codes, into fabrics. The kids, kids' pajamas, they can't burst into flames. That's illegal. And we have, do fire education in schools. So we have taught fire. That's a great example. We've taken fire prevention out of the hands of the fire department. They're not held, they're the last case. When you call the fire department is when everything else has failed. But we have engineered fire prevention all through society. And we need to be rethinking about health and emerging diseases and pandemics that way. That's what I'm saying, it's everybody's responsibility. I think there's a great opportunity, and we just need to have more people like you mentioning the fact that there are all these collateral benefits in risk reduction. So as I was mentioning before, all around Jakarta, Indonesia, if you go up into the hills, you go up to Bogor, all of that land used to be beautiful forest. And of course, you have rainy season and all the rain soaked right into the ground. And now it's shopping malls and parking lots and buildings, and it rains and all the rain runs down the mountains and it all ends up in Jakarta is underwater. So it's all about land use change. That was just a great example of no disaster risk reduction strategy put into the thinking for that planning.
Right. Thank you for that really in-depth answer. And this ties into two questions from the audience. One is, would you be able to provide more climate change related issues in this aspect of health security? And then second question is, the disaster threat is mostly in relation to Megachiroptera fruit bats. And that's from Sheila.
Was that a question about the large fruit bats or a statement?
Sheila, are you there? Would you like to clarify your question? She's asking if the disease.
It was about the SARS threat. Is the current SARS threat, and when that was described earlier, is it mostly related, and they were talking about it being related to bats. I'm wondering if the main threat is from fruit bats. Thank you. I mean, if the reservoir is mainly fruit bats for that type, this virus type. Thank you.
No, in fact, it's not. That cluster of coronaviruses that I showed the tree is a whole different genera, a whole different actually family of bats that are insectivorous. So they're not large fruit bats in that. So there's a kind of a guild, and I could pull that slide up. There's 7 or 8, 9 species. And maybe 1 or 2 genera that we're finding a lot of these coronaviruses in there, and they're insectivorous bats, and smaller insectivorous bats. What was the first part of that question about climate change?
The first question was to provide some more climate change specificity, which is what you said about land use change. But this question comes from Mustafa. If you wish to clarify or expand your question, please unmute yourself. Mustafa, are you here?
Or any just interesting thoughts to share?
Yeah. We also have a question from Alicia. Alicia, would you like to unmute yourself?
Sure. So again, Alicia Entum here at Yale. Dr. Karesh, I just want to start my question by saying that I'm really interested in the connections between political economy and the environment. And I appreciate the fact that you've created this prediction model for emergent disease risks and the use of those important correlates in the prediction model, because as you point out, it's an improvement upon the bias, through sampling bias or study bias, labeling of risk areas based on detected disease or people's favorite viruses or study animals, as you say. However, I wonder whether or not there's been efforts to sort of back those prediction models up even one step further by looking at like the fundamental institutions that are driving your current correlates of land use change, agricultural industry changes, example. So like, do you think that a risk map would look different if you had a model that actually predicts your risk factor correlates based on fundamental institutions of nations like state capacity, land tenure, property rights, norms, etc. So backing it up even one more step in this idea of predicting.
I think that's a really interesting question, an interesting thought, and it would be a great project for someone to do that. I do know the original work, it was, I think there were like 250, 260 kind of available globally gridded data sets, of the resolution needed. And of those, in analyzing all of those, that's where the kind of that land use change, mammal biodiversity, human population growth, those things came out is correlated with those things. There was, they're great data sets. We looked at GDP, we looked at number of healthcare providers, the number of hospitals, the number of people, education per capita, socioeconomic data, all of those, and there weren't correlations. And it's interesting that the amount invested in healthcare doesn't relate to where these diseases emerge. And unsurprisingly, look at the US. We spend more in healthcare than anywhere in the world. We've not done a great job with COVID-19. So there you go. There's a great, interesting back testing of the model. And it did show that you're just throwing money in the healthcare systems is actually not solving that problem. We have other benefits from it. I'm not saying it's bad to invest in healthcare. It's just, it doesn't fix that particular problem. So I think the governance thing is kind of interesting. And I wonder if there's some proxies. I wonder if dramatic land use changes, some kind of a proxy statement about governments and corruption. I don't know. I don't, now I'm stepping into your area. You know more about that than I do. But, you know, I think that's an interesting thing if we're going to try to find ways to resolve it. And in each country, of course, that's going to be different. But you might be onto something. I think that's really interesting.
Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Alicia. And we have another question from Professor Montagnini. Professor Montagnini, do you want me to read it or do you want to ask it yourself?
I can ask directly. I really enjoyed your presentation because you really hit the point. You say we know how to prevent things, especially when you now gave an answer about, you are talking about how in New York, then you have prevention things about fire. I think the same we could do here in Connecticut, where flood in the shoreline happens every year. Why don't they prevent that by not allowing building in front of the ocean? Things like that, little details like that. But my question to you more specifically is, I also like your comment about the vaccine, how expensive it is and all that. And what I heard yesterday was really alarming. The news were saying that 75% of the vaccine has been administered so far in only 17 countries of the world. So then that doesn't do anything because then the new variants are happening like in Sao Paulo, the Sao Paulo variant, the South African variant, and how is vaccination happening in those countries? Not only that, but the spread of the virus keeps happening. And in this globalized world, everyone travels everywhere. So people from the US, even those that are vaccinated, will be traveling to places in Africa, in Latin America, in Europe, where vaccination still hasn't happened perhaps, and they will bring the virus again, because even though if you are vaccinated, you can still say you can carry the virus. So it wouldn't be the best thing to just focus the international help or whatever is done to actually focus on vaccination in those countries, not just in the privileged countries who have the money for doing it, but give them the vaccines for free in places all around the world. So then you can control the pandemic much easier that way than if you just focus in our countries. Wouldn't that be a solution or part of a solution?
Well, I think it would help. I mean, there's a production, you know, there's limits to the quantity of production. So then you get into whatever the game theory is about allocation of scarce resources, right? And I guess that's how it starts. Now, 3 years from now, there'll be plenty of vaccine and maybe less interest in using it. And that's another problem with the vaccine approach. I don't know that at this point, we have no choice but to, you know, use a vaccine as part of the way to deal with this. The other is social distancing and mask wearing and good hygiene. That would also help because you can, you know, stop transmission that way, and then you won't have the virus. I just think the unfortunate part is we just, in this current thinking, this is what I'm saying, kind of, it's a 20th century solution. And it was really worked. I mean, we really did great things with vaccines because the easy ones were done. Childhood diseases are really good use for vaccination because the disease ecology of those diseases, they depend on a naive young population, and you can get them and they're in childhood and they're easy access. And you set those systems up and vaccinate kids. And they are usually lifetime vaccines. You don't have to repeat them. So that's the low-hanging fruit. What happened from that was a lot of people go like, wow, vaccines are really the answer to everything. No, they're really good for measles, mumps, rubella, or chicken pox, things that basically will get you through 50 years if you're vaccinated as a kid. Then, because creating a vaccine is the easy part. Vaccination programs are hard. That's what we've seen with COVID-19. And no one talked about, a year ago, there were very few of us going like, making the vaccines the easiest part. Everybody thinks that's the cool, big success is you made a vaccine. No, that's the easy part. Vaccination programs are really challenging. We still are vaccinating a few leftover countries for polio. That's 70 years to vaccinate the planet. It is hard to have a good vaccine program for humans or for animals. People are dying. 20, 30,000 people die in India from rabies, from dog bites, because we can't vaccinate dogs in India. It's hard. We have a great vaccine. It's cheap. It costs 25 cents. We can make more than we can ever use. Vaccine programs are hard because it's a cultural, it's not cultural, it's a social thing, and you have to invest the time and energy and the money. So everybody's, we got a vaccine, the problem solved, let's move on. The stock market's going back up, we got a vaccine, the wealthy people are there, fine, everybody's more comfortable. Next year we'll meet in person, yay, problem solved. But it's not really, it's just a false sense of security, and it's not the long-term solution.
Right. Thank you very much. I think it's the point.
We have another question from Aksha, who asked, you mentioned that those who live near caves are seropositive and have for years. So does the problem arise only with new non-local food habits, trade, or is it climate change? I'm going to paste it again. You want me to read it again?
Could you please?
Yes. So she says, you mentioned that those who lived near caves are seropositive and have for years. So does the problem arise only with new non-local food habits, trade, or is it climate change?
Well, I think, it's very interesting to be teasing that apart. And I think we're going to, had you asked me that question 10 years ago, I would say we really don't have strong enough data sets to relate it to climate change, because I just don't think we've been pulling that information together well enough until more recently. But I think now we can say much more confidently about what some of these changes are with climate change. And of course, it's going to affect animal distributions and migration patterns and timing. I think it's safe to say we will see new things arise from that. And I don't know what those are. We've done some projections on mammal distribution or bat geographic distribution with some of the different climate change scenarios, and you can map out where estimated species distributions will change, and we know which viruses those species have. So the risk of human contact does move geographically, and you can do some of that with mapping that out geographically. I can't say that this one particular virus at this particular cave, that's a harder thing to pin down. But I think it's clearly safe to say that what the trends we're seeing will have effect. On the other hand, of course, in some places we're going to see a reduction of some diseases and some species caused by climate change, and in other places we'll see an increase. But basically, we're seeing a shift, a shifting of patterns.
Right. Those are good points. And Romy, she raised her hand. I'm so sorry if I mispronounced your name. Oh, you're muted.
That's okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Romy. I'm really glad to be part of this conference. And as a student, I was part of organizing this ISTF conference. And Professor, thank you so much for this amazing talk you gave. And I really appreciate your comments on the vaccination, that it's not a silver bullet. My question to you is, the pandemic has sort of distanced or given this scary feeling to general parents, don't go outside, don't touch animals. And we grew up playing in the mud and rolling in the mud and jumping in rivers if possible, and not coming home until we were hungry. I think a lot of the young people that are growing today don't have this opportunity, and to some extent then we also lose having immunity to and protection from many other things. So what would you say to a parent who has a young child like myself about this?
Well, from my personal experience of living with people that tend to have higher anxiety than I do, it's very difficult. It's a big challenge to get people to relax a little. Of course, they always say the worst thing you can say is don't panic, because that stimulates the part of the brain that causes panic. So you should never tell people not to panic. So hopefully all your heart rates have gone up just a little bit in me saying 3 times don't panic. So it's a really social dilemma in getting people to relax. And I can relate. I grew up playing in the mud and only coming home when I was hungry. And I had pet raccoons, which of course you would never do now because they all have rabies, but they lived in the house. So, but no, I'm a big advocate for getting dirty and letting your kids roll around in the mud. I don't know how we raise people's comfort level. We see though, I mean, my grandparents and my ex-wife's grandparents and her family still, because they went through the 1918 flu, and they still, when I go visit them, well, I don't know, they're dead, but I visit their children who are the parents. They're like pouring bottles of ammonia in their laundry still 100 years later because they're afraid of germs, because their parents exposed that. So it has long-lasting societal effects. I don't think, we can kind of joke about it, but no, it'll have a serious effect, and it will be for a long time. On the other hand, as part of this is that 99% of people that get COVID-19, survive, and only 80% don't really get very ill. So we also kind of out of context because of the horrible nature of some people dying. And the numbers happened so fast that hospitals got overwhelmed. So it's all over the news. In some ways, it's a little out of proportion with the real personal risk. I mean, the risk to any one individual is not that great, but it's scary. And that's what you're really talking about. It's about fear. It's not about the statistics of individual risk. It's really about fear. And that's a huge challenge. I don't know how to say that, but to help people talk through it. But anxiety is a tough one.
Great, thank you. We also have 2 more questions, and I know it's past 9:30, so Dr. Karesh, if you have to go, please let us know. I know we said until 9:30, but we have a question from Amy Vetter. Do you have time to answer that?
Amy Vetter, Dr. Vetter. Hello, oh my God.
Dr. Karesh, great to see you, and a great talk, and it's wonderful to hear of your work. We knew each other years ago. So as a conservation biologist and a conservationist in practice, I'm interested in how, as you think about One Health, and you've worked so deeply on this over these years, one of the major emphases in conservation these days is connectivity and making sure that there's the opportunity for species movements and gene flow, and if we're going to succeed in the longer run. And yet one of the key factors that may help in preventing the spread of disease is isolation and breaking some of these connections. In principle, okay, good, tell me why I'm wrong. And as you look at the larger picture, how does one deal with these potentially counteracting concerns that we have? And if you want to bring up Ebola and gorillas long ago, tell us.
Yeah, okay. All right, that's a really great point. And of course, there's nothing perfect. There's no perfect solution. I think, a lot of the real risk of connectivity issues is about human movement, human transport, human mediated moving of animals. So that captures 95% of the risk. And then we might be able to then find a case where some animals naturally migrating occasionally cause a problem. And we can make a big deal about it, but it's probably 5% of the real risk. But so it's really about where you want to depend on. And I think the best example, of course, is that's about migratory waterfowl and birds and influenza, right? With its global distribution, or at least north-south global movements, and about the risk. And yeah, one solution could be to get rid of all of them. But we're talking about billions of birds. I mean, I was talking to people the other day. I think it's might be the largest cool biological phenomena on terrestrial Earth, is the fact that 3 or 4 billion waterfowl are born in the Arctic Circle every spring, hatch, and move across the globe every year and then go back. And you just